thank you, Dr. Bob Gill, for coming on, agreeing to talk about the NHS. You obviously won't be able to be on the show tomorrow at lunchtime because you'll be working in the NHS. So thank you for that, for doing that. And I'm just going to play you a clip. It's relating to the NHS. It's an interview with Wes Streeting, who's the Shadow Health Secretary, and it was on LBC last night. I just wondered what you thought about it.
What I've said to the NHS is I recognise that there isn't an answer to the immediate crisis, which doesn't require more investment, which is why we've committed to the workforce investment. But I've also been honest in saying that if the answer in this century is always more taxpayers' money into a 20th century model of care, there isn't going to be an NHS in the long term. So that's why, if we're elected at the next election, Labour's job will be to grip the immediate crisis, but also to make the right long-term decisions so we've got an NHS fit for the future.
Bob, what I don't get from that is he says that the NHS can't continue if it's relying on taxpayers' money. Does that mean that he's thinking of some other kind of money? I don't really understand what do you think he means by that?
Well, he's not being clear, but if you understand what's been going on over the last 30, 40 years, the NHS in the condition it is now, particularly with the passage of the Health and Care Act in July of this year, the NHS is now positioned to be taken over by private companies. The amount of services provided by the NHS are getting less and less, waiting lists are getting longer. And Wes Streeting spells out that actually we're not going to carry on with this model. That's what he's saying. And the only way people are going to make up for healthcare is to take out top-up insurance. Now, the whole conversion of a public service over to an American insurance-style service has taken 3 decades, and New Labour have been signed up to this project. For a short period in the Corbyn years, we had some discussion about privatisation, but Streeting is being indirect, but he's signalling this is the direction that New Labour under Starmer will continue.
I mean, I've got a good a sort of film about how the NHS has changed its structure, just so people can see how it's worked out over the last few decades, as you say. I'm just going to play that. Maybe you can give shed some more light on it afterwards.
The outsourcing of non-medical services and repurposing the NHS into a business was followed by the imposition of an internal market. Financial destabilization with private debt and the expansion of outsourcing to core service provision then transitioned in 2012 into a full compulsory external market. Hospitals now free to earn half their income from private patients. By 2014, the essential covert groundwork was completed ahead of the final phase, converting the NHS into an American-style accountable care model and privatizing control of NHS budget.
Now, that looks so sneaky that they've sort of done these things gradually, slowly. And the thing is, each of those governments, there have been different colours. There have been the Labour government and the Tory government have done that. But they've all said we are saving the NHS. They keep saying, a bit like what Wes Streeting was saying, we can't keep the NHS going in the way it is. We've got to make some reforms to it. But they're not saying we're actually destroying the NHS while they say it. It's a very clever kind of distraction technique, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So what they are saying and it's interesting, the hints they are giving, but particularly what is noticeable to me is what they are not saying. The Health and Care Act this year that passed through Parliament completed the final step. It's created 42 new public-private partnerships, and these will be dominated by corporations. They will be allowed to decide how much service to provide. So either, you do without treatment, or you have to find yourself taking out top-up insurance or paying out of pocket. Those are the only options. But what none of these politicians are explaining is the NHS beverage model is the cheapest, most efficient way to provide healthcare. What they are copying is the American model, which creates a parallel bureaucracy of insurance, which doubles the cost that people will pay either through taxation or privately through their own pocket. It will double the cost, worsen the quality of service, and introduce fraud, bureaucracy, and fragmentation into the system. But they cannot spell this out to people, because if you look at it logically, if you take out political ideology, if you look at it in logical, hard economic terms, the model they are copying is a disaster, and they cannot face the challenge. So they have to be surreptitious about it.
Yeah, and if they're both parties are doing the same kind of thing, then they're not going to call the other one out, are they? They'll both say that they're trying to protect the NHS and say we're going to give more money to the NHS or some sort of thing like that to prove that they're committed. But they're eroding its foundations, both of them at the same time.
Yeah, the foundations have gone, Crispin. In 2012, the duty of Secretary of State to provide healthcare was abolished, effectively removing the founding principle of the NHS. And just this year, they've handed the control of NHS budgets over to private corporations and insurance companies. So this is not some hypothetical loss in the future. Essentially, the NHS as we know it has disappeared, but no politician dare explain it to people. What they're constantly doing, as you're saying, is talking about more money. But what we need to understand is, where is this more money going? It's going into service private finance initiative debt. It's going into pay for the market bureaucracy, which is extremely wasteful. Estimates a minimum of 10% of the NHS budget is wasted in marketization. And, you know, where else is the money going? You're feeding a huge management bureaucracy. And as the NHS starts to fail, people waiting longer and longer, their care actually gets more expensive. And we have a burgeoning medico-legal bill, which we're all going to be footing. So this is extremely wasteful, what they're doing. And we need to be conscious. We don't want to be pouring more money into a bucket which has massive holes. It's a bit like subsidizing the energy companies. We should be renationalizing them, not throwing money at into a public subsidy to support extortionate profiteering.
Now, what you're doing in this interview is showing us how they're kind of they're bamboozling us really with what they're doing, both parties, and Wes Streeting's getting involved in that as well. I noticed on Twitter an exchange between Prem Sikka, who we know a lot on the show, has been on the show, and Wes Streeting. I just wondered what you thought of this. Prem Sikka says, as a Labour peer, let me say that this is unacceptable. This is about the interview that Wes Streeting did. The NHS needs to be publicly owned, free at point of delivery. Anything less condemns millions to misery. There is no shortage of resources. Must also improve people's health, better wages, food, pension, housing, environment. To which Wes Streeting replies, as an elected Labour MP, I'm happy to reassure you that I will always defend an NHS that is publicly funded and free at the point of use. I've done so frequently in recent weeks in the face of siren attacks on this equitable principle from the right. So what I'm wondering is, Prem has put the NHS needs to be publicly owned, free at point of delivery, and Wes Streeting has not replied the same way. He says publicly funded and free at the point of use. Is he deliberately not using the same terms? Is he thinking they're synonymous and not and knowing they're not? What is the difference there?
Well, he's using the language I hear from the Tory MPs as well, publicly funded, right? Remember, Test and Trace was publicly funded, but who delivered it? It was Serco and Deloitte, and it was a very expensive fiasco. What they are never clear about is delivery. We need healthcare to be delivered by public employees, public servants, people who are well rewarded for being qualified and doing a responsible job. But Streeting is very careful to avoid those terms because he knows the NHS now is set up as a budget to be raided by corporations. That's what it is. So we are funding something that will be used to extract profit. Wes Streeting knows this. That's why he chooses his words very carefully.
Right. Well, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Sorry to keep you, only been busy today, and sorry to keep you waiting, but I think that's going to be a great little clip. And keep people informed. It's just they are just such cunning bastards with the way they use language and try and twist things around. It's unbelievable. And the media don't say anything. Can I
add a sentence?
Yeah, sure.
So
I've just said bastards in it, but anyway, go on.
You might, if you want to edit it separately. The game the Tories and the Labour Party are playing is to keep people in the dark very deliberately. They use diversion. Only today I heard them talking about not wanting to solve the NHS workforce crisis by importing overseas healthcare workers. Well, this is all fitting in to the general theme of making anti-immigrant comments and fueling prejudice as a distraction for a lot of the austerity and the public service damaging cuts that they're going to make. Both parties are on the same agenda, I'm afraid.